Thank you. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It is such a true delight for me to be here. My husband and I drove in earlier today in the rain, and the first thing we wanted to do was to visit the museum because we'd been told by so many people what a significant museum this is in terms of understanding our history as Americans as well as the life and the work of Abraham Lincoln. And I must say that it has been one of the most moving museum visits I've ever had, which is what makes it so important and such a good honor for me to read here tonight. And I was reminded of one of the reasons why this has always been something I was headed towards, something important to me. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Walking through here and hearing the voices of dissent, the voices of approval, was so meaningful. And I remembered being a child in 4th or 5th grade going to another historic site that seemed in my mind not to have anything to do with Lincoln, but there in the gift shop, they had the little parchment of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and I begged my mother to let me use my allowance to buy it. I think what's significant about that to me is that I've become a poet, and that was the very first thing I ever memorized. For the lyricism of it, the beauty of it, and the truth of it, I memorized that before I ever committed to memory a poem. So tonight I'm going to read mostly from my collection, Native Guard, but a few poems from the new collection, Thrall, ones that I think matter in our thinking about our national memory and our national history as we think about at this anniversary the movement from Civil War to civil rights and beyond. My life, which spans those things in some interesting ways, and infuses the poems with a personal narrative as well as a larger public historical narrative. I was born in Gulfport, Mississippi in 1966, April 26, which is Confederate Memorial Day, exactly 100 years to the day that the South first celebrated that holiday. Outside of Mississippi, Gulfport, Mississippi, along the coast was a series of barrier islands, one of them Ship Island, which was home to the Louisiana Native Guards, one of the first officially sanctioned regiments of African-American Union soldiers in the Civil War. They were mustered into service in September, October, and November of 1862, of course, following Lincoln's preliminary decree of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Major Dumas, who I write about in these poems, was the son of a white planter father and an octoroon mother who, when his father died, inherited a plantation. And of course, it was illegal at that time to manumit slaves in Louisiana. But when this decree came from Lincoln and the Union Army began to recruit black soldiers, he encouraged his men of age to enlist, and he enlisted and became an officer himself. The poem has an epigraph from Allen Tate's poem, Ode to the Confederate Dead. Now that the salt of their blood stiffens the saltier oblivion of the sea. Elegy for the Native Guards. We leave Gulfport at noon, gulls overhead trailing the boat, streamers, noisy fanfare, all the way to Ship Island. What we see first is the fort, its roof of grass a lee, half reminder of the men who served there, a weathered monument to some of the dead. Inside we follow the ranger, hurried though we are to get to the beach. He tells of graves lost in the Gulf, the island split in half when Hurricane Camille hit, shows us casemates, cannons, the store that sells souvenirs, tokens of history long buried. The Daughters of the Confederacy has placed a plaque here at the fort's entrance, each Confederate soldier's name raised hard in bronze, no names carved for the Native Guards, 2nd Regiment Union men, Black Phalanx. What is monument to their legacy. All the grave markers, all the crude headstones, water lost. Now fish dart among their bones, and we listen for what the waves intone. Only the fort remains, near 40 feet high, round, unfinished, half open to the sky, the elements, wind, rain, God's deliberate eye. When I was growing up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, I used to go out to the fort on Ship Island every summer with my grandmother to take a tour of the fort and then to spend the rest of the time on the beach picnicking. And at no point during that visit did the park rangers ever mention anything about the black soldiers who had been stationed on Ship Island or the work that they did guarding Confederate prisoners. And if you didn't know to ask about it, it would be totally overlooked in the tour. When I did find out about it, it was one of those happy accidents. I was back on the coast with my grandmother to take her out to a restaurant, and I was talking about an assignment I was going to give my students in a creative writing class to write a poem about the time someone in their family met someone famous. And the reason that I was going to assign this is that my grandmother always told me the story about her brother shaking Al Capone's hand when her brother was a bellhop at a restaurant at a hotel on the beach. Al Capone used to come down and go out to one of the barrier islands for offshore gambling. And this is all I knew about Ship Island at the time. And there was a woman listening to our conversation the whole time who must have been a librarian. God love him. And when she got up, she said, "I think there's something else you need to know about Ship Island." And she told me about the Native Guards. And the next thing you know, I found myself in the public library trying to do some research to figure out more about that story. And so this is the poem that comes out of that. The Louisiana Native Guards, as I mentioned, were mustered into service in September, October, and November of 1862. The 1st Regiment thus becoming the first officially sanctioned regiment of African-American Union soldiers, though not as popular, of course, as the Massachusetts 54th. The battles, the skirmishes that I mentioned in the poem are accurate. The slave that I imagine, the former slave of Major Dumas, that quadroon, octoroon son of a planter father, is given the Army's duty of writing those letters home to family members of the dead to let them know what has happened. And like Walt Whitman, he talks to the soldiers who are unable to write home for some reason, those Confederate soldiers, and writes letters for them as well. The poem has an epigraph from Frederick Douglass that reads, "If this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?" Native Guard, November 1862. Truth be told, I do not want to forget anything of my former life, the landscape song of bondage, dirge in the river's throat where it churns into the gulf, wind in trees choked with vines. I thought to carry with me want of freedom, though I had been freed, remembrance, not constant recollection. Yes, I was born a slave at harvest time in the parish of Ascension. I've reached 33 with history of one younger inscribed upon my back. I now use ink to keep record, a closed book, not the lure of memory, flawed, changeful, that dulls the lash for the master, sharpens it for the slave. December 1862. For the slave, having a master sharpens the bend into work, the way the sergeant moves us now to perfect battalion drill, dress parade. Still, we're called supply units, not infantry, and so we dig trenches, haul burdens for the army, no less heavy than before. I heard the colonel call it nigger work. Half rations make our work familiar still. We take those things we need from the Confederates' abandoned homes, salt, sugar, even this journal, near full with someone else's words, overlapped now, cross-hatched beneath mine, on every page, his story intersecting with my own. January 1863. Oh, how history intersects, my own birth upon a ship called the Northern Star, and I'm delivered into a new life. Fort Massachusetts, a great irony, both path and destination of freedom I'd not dared to travel. Here now I walk, ankle deep in sand, fly-bitten, nearly smothered by heat, and yet I can look out upon the Gulf and see the surf breaking, tossing the ships, the great gunboats bobbing on the water. And are we not the same, slaves in the hands of the master, destiny, night sky red with the promise of fortune, dawn pink as new flesh, healing, unfettered. January 1863. Today, dawn red as warning, unfettered supplies stacked on the beach at our landing, washed away in the storm that rose too fast, caught us unprepared. Later, as we worked, I joined in the low singing someone raised to pace us and felt a bond in labor I had not known. It was then a dark man removed his shirt, revealed the scars cross-hatched like the lines in this journal on his back. It was he who remarked at how the ropes cracked like whips on the sand, made us take note of the wild dance of a tent loosed by wind. We watched and learned, like any shrewd master. We know now to tie down what we will keep. February 1863. We know it is our duty now to keep white men as prisoners, rebel soldiers, would-be masters. We're all bondsmen here, each to the other. Freedom has gotten them captivity, for us a conscription we have chosen, jailers to those who still would have us slaves. They are cautious, dreading the sight of us. Some neither read nor write, are laid too low, and have few words to send, but those I give them. Still, they are wary of a Negro writing, taking down letters. X binds them to the page, a mute symbol like the cross on a grave. I suspect they fear I'll listen, put something else down in ink. March 1863. I listen, put down in ink what I know they labor to say between silences too big for words. Worry for beloveds. My dearest, how are you getting along? What has become of their small plots of land? Did you harvest enough food to put by? They long for the comfort of former lives. I see you as you were, waving goodbye. Some send photographs, a likeness in case the body can't return. Others dictate harsh facts of this war. The hot air carries the stench of limbs, rotten in the bone pit. Flies swarm, a black cloud. We hunger, grow weak. When men die, we eat their share of hardtack. April 1863. When men die, we eat their share of hardtack, trying not to recall their hollow sockets, the worm stitch of their cheeks. Today, we buried the last of our dead from Pascagoula and those who died retreating to our ship, white sailors in blue firing upon us as if we were the enemy. I thought the fighting over, then watched a man fall beside me, knees first as in prayer, then another, his arms outstretched as if borne upon the cross. Smoke that rose from each gun seemed a soul departing. The colonel said, an unfortunate incident, said, their name shall deck the page of history. June 1863. Some name shall deck the page of history as it is written on stone. Some will not. Yesterday, word came of colored troops dead on the battlefield at Port Hudson, how General Banks was heard to say, I have no dead there, and left them unclaimed. Last night I dreamt their eyes still open, dim, clouded as the eyes of fish washed ashore, yet fixed, staring back at me. Still more come today, eager to enlist. Their bodies, haggard faces, gaunt limbs, bring news of the mainland. Starved, they suffer like our prisoners. Dying, they plead for what we do not have to give. Death makes equals of us all, a fair master. August 1864. Dumas was a fair master to us all. He taught me to read and write. I was a man-servant, if not a man. At my work, I studied natural things, all manner of plants, birds I draw now in my book, wren, willet, egret, loon. Tending the gardens, I thought only to study live things, thought never to know so much about the dead. Now I tend Ship Island graves, mounds like dunes that shift and disappear. I record names, send home simple notes, not much more than how and when, an official duty. I'm told it's best to spare most detail, but I know there are things which must be accounted for. 1865. These are things which must be accounted for. Slaughter under the white flag of surrender, black massacre at Fort Pillow, our new name, the Corps d'Afrique, words that take the native from our claim, mossbacks and freedmen, exiles in their own homeland, the disease, the maimed, every lost limb and what remains, phantom ache, memory haunting an empty sleeve, the hog eaten at Gettysburg, unmarked in their graves, all the dead letters unanswered, untold stories of those that time will render mute. Beneath battlefields, green again, the dead molder, a scaffolding of bone we tread upon, forgetting, truth be told. Thank you. You know, one of the things that I often think about is the intersection between our personal history and our personal memory and public history and cultural memory, and what gets left out or forgotten or given short shrift in the historical record. Now, certainly, there are many historians who've been writing about the Native Guards, and yet, in terms of public memory, they are lesser known than, say, the Massachusetts 54th. I just met a woman named Carol, whose husband is a historian and a park ranger, who goes around the country giving lectures about the Native Guards, these lesser-known soldiers. One of the ways that I think we also see this sort of representation of what's lesser known is in the imagery that we're given. And so this next poem is about a wonderful painting by Winslow Homer that many of you have perhaps seen. It's a painting called Veteran in a New Field. And there's an epigraph that quotes a former Civil War soldier writing about the dead that he saw during his time. It reads, "The dead, they lay along the lines like sheaves of wheat. I could have walked on the bodies almost from one end to the other." Again, the fields. No more muskets, the bone-drag weariness of marching, the trampled grass, soaked earth red as the wine of sacrament. Now the veteran turns toward a new field, bright as domes of the Republic. Here he is shrugged off the past, his jacket and canteen flung down in the corner. At the center of the painting, he anchors the Trinity, joining earth and sky. The wheat falls beneath his scythe, a language of bounty, the swaths like scripture on the field's open page. Boundless, the wheat stretches beyond the frame, as if toward a distant field, the white canvas where sky and cotton meet, where another veteran toils, his hands the color of dark soil. One of the things that I decided when I wanted to write this book is that I had to make a kind of journey back to Mississippi, to my home state, to look at these places, to see them again, and to think about the cultural memory that we shared as Mississippians and the forgetting that we also shared. I mentioned to you earlier that I was born exactly 100 years to the day that Mississippi first celebrated Confederate Memorial Day. I've always tried to get people to call me Dixie, but it just hasn't taken. I was happy to see that Lincoln asked someone to play Dixie for him in the museum today. I think that what was interesting about going to Vicksburg for the first time, and perhaps some of you have taken part in this, a few southern cities have annual pilgrimages, often twice a year in the spring and the fall, and they were started not long after the Civil War in order to boost the economy of some of these struggling post-war cities. And so they would sort of trot out all of the old antebellum stuff. You know, the women would wear antebellum dresses and give tours of these great plantations and mansions. And visitors not only from around the South, but also Northerners who wanted to get a little bit of a taste of what the antebellum South had been like and is like, still go there now. When I went, I called one of the particular mansions, a mansion called Cedar Grove, and asked them for a room. And I had picked out a room online. I wanted to stay in the room called the library, which seemed like a perfect place for me. But that room wasn't available, so they offered me instead General Sherman's room, which I ended up taking. But let me just say, in the conversation, the woman on the phone said, well, there's some lovely rooms, inside the mansion, but we also have renovated this lovely carriage house out back, and so you're welcome to stay there. And I said, well, no, I want to be in the big house. Well, you can only imagine the haunting that I got for, taking myself into the big house. The other thing that's interesting, once I was there, I thought I was going to write a poem called The Occupied City. It was fascinating to me that at that turning point in the war, when Vicksburg fell to the Union, in order to somehow maybe slap Mississippians in the face, they sent 5,000 U.S. colored troops to occupy that city. It was an occupied city, and because Vicksburg was so mad about that, they didn't celebrate Independence Day, the 4th of July, for years. It was only Confederate Memorial Day. Now, my birthday is an interesting date also because my birth date 10 years later, April 26, 1876, is the day that the Mississippi River turned its back on Vicksburg and left. And so the Army Corps of Engineers had to reroute the Yazoo River so that Vicksburg would not be left high and dry, that it would still be a river city. This is Pilgrimage, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Here, the Mississippi carved its mud-dark path, a graveyard for skeletons of sunken riverboats. Here, the river changed its course, turning away from the city as one turns, forgetting from the past. The abandoned bluffs, land sloping up above the river's bend, where now the Yazoo fills the Mississippi's empty bed. Here, the dead stand up in stone, white marble on Confederate Avenue. I stand on ground once hollowed by a web of caves. They must have seemed like catacombs in 1863 to the woman sitting in her parlor, candle lit, underground. I can see her listening to shells explode, writing herself into history, asking what is to become of all the living things in this place. This whole city is a grave. Every spring pilgrimage, the living come to mingle with the dead, brush against their cold shoulders in the long hallways, listen all night to their silence and indifference, relive their dying on the green battlefield. At the museum, we marvel at their clothes, preserved under glass, so much smaller than our own, as if those who wore them were only children. We sleep in their beds, the old mansions hunkered on the bluffs, draped in flowers, funereal, a blur of petals against the river's gray. The brochure in my room calls this living history. The brass plate on the door reads, Prissy's room. A window frames the river's crawl toward the Gulf. In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm. You know, one of the other interesting things about Lincoln's time in office is that in the months leading up to his re-election, the word miscegenation first entered the American lexicon. And of course, miscegenation is a word that means intermarriage, marriage between particularly whites and blacks. And this entered the lexicon leading up to his re-election in the form of a pamphlet by a couple of journalists who published it to scare the American public into worrying about what would happen if Lincoln were to be reelected. Amalgamation, a lot of mongrel mixed race people like me being all of a sudden born. We think of that as such ancient history, it seems, you know, at this 150th anniversary, and yet only in the mid-90s did the state of Alabama vote to remove the anti-miscegenation laws from the books. And though they did vote to get rid of them, 40-some% of the population voted to keep them, so that at least symbolically it could be said that parents like mine shouldn't be married and people like me born legally in the state. Miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke 2 laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi. So at that time, and around the time, of course, that our president was born, there were over 20 states in the nation that had anti-miscegenation laws. And I, in this poem, try to imagine what it must have been like for my mother to be thinking about bringing a child into that America and imagining another one. My mother dreams another country. Already the words are changing. She is changing from colored to Negro, black still years ahead. This is 1966. She is married to a white man, and there are more names for what grows inside her. It is enough to worry about words like mongrel and the infertility of mules and mulattoes while flipping through a book of baby names. She has come home to wait out the long months, her room unchanged since she's been gone, dolls winking down from every shelf, all of them white. Every day she is flanked by the rituals of superstition, and there is a name she will learn for this too, maternal impression, the shape like an unknown country marking the back of the newborn's thigh. For now, women tell her to clear her head, to steady her hands, or she'll gray a lock of the child's hair wherever she worries her own, imprint somewhere the outline of a thing she craves too much. They tell her to stanch her cravings by eating dirt. All spring she has sat on her hands, her fingers numb. For a while each day she can't feel anything she touches, the arbor out back, the landscape's green tangle, the molehill of her own swelling. Here, outside the city limits, cars speed by, clouds of red dust in their wake. She breathes it in, Mississippi, then drifts toward sleep, thinking of some place she's never been. Late, Mississippi is a dark backdrop bearing down on the windows of her room. On the TV in the corner, the station signs off, broadcasting its nightly salutation, the waving stars and stripes, our national anthem. Incident. We tell the story every year, how we peered from the windows, shades drawn, though nothing really happened, the charred grass now green again. We peered from the windows, shades drawn, at the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, the charred grass still green. Then we darkened our rooms, lit the hurricane lamps. At the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, a few men gathered, white as angels in their gowns. We darkened our rooms and lit hurricane lamps, the wicks trembling in their fonts of oil. It seemed the angels had gathered, white men in their gowns. When they were done, they left quietly. No one came. The wicks trembled all night in their fonts of oil. By morning, the flames had all dimmed. When they were done, the men left quietly. No one came. Nothing really happened. By morning, all the flames had dimmed. We tell the story every year. Southern Gothic. I have lain down into 1970, into the bed my parents will share for only a few more years. Early evening, they have not yet turned from each other in sleep, their bodies curved, parentheses framing the separate lives they'll wake to. Dreaming, I am again the child with too many questions, the endless why and why and why. My mother cannot answer, her mouth closed, a gesture toward her future, cold lips stitched shut. The lines in my young father's face deepen toward an expression of grief. I have come home from the schoolyard with the words that shadow us in this small southern town. Peckerwood and nigger lover, half-breed and zebra, words that take shape outside us. We're huddled on the tiny island of bed, quiet in the language of blood, the house unsteady on its cinder block haunches, sinking deeper into the muck of ancestry. Oil lamps flicker around us, our shadows, dark glyphs on the wall. bigger and stranger than we are. And one of my heroes is Robert Penn Warren. He wrote not only a lot of wonderful poems and some novels you might be familiar with, but he also wrote a wonderful book called The Legacy of the Civil War, and one called Segregation, which is a sort of a rethinking and a revisit to his own South after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, in which he rethinks his earlier position from the anthology I'll Take My Stand. And so not too long ago, I went to, in 1999, I went to the Millennial Gathering of Writers of the New South at Vanderbilt, in which we gathered as writers to think about the New South in terms of literature at that particular moment. And we took a photograph, and I felt very much like I was communing with Robert Penn Warren. This is a poem that ends with a line borrowed in slightly different form from Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. Pastoral. In the dream, I am with the fugitive poets. We're gathered for a photograph. Behind us, the skyline of Atlanta, hidden by the photographer's backdrop. A lush pasture, green, full of soft-eyed cows, lowing a chant that sounds like no, no. Yes, I say, to the glass of bourbon I'm offered. We're lining up now, Robert Penn Warren, his voice just audible above the drone of bulldozers, telling us where to stand. Say, race, the photographer croons. I'm in blackface again when the flash freezes us. My father's white, I tell them, and rural. You don't hate the South, they ask. You don't hate it? I don't think I've ever confessed this out loud, but this is the next poem, is a poem I wrote in response to The Help. It's after a photograph from The Americans by Robert Frank. Help, 1968. When I see Frank's photograph of a white infant in the dark arms of a woman who must be the maid, I think of my mother and the year we spent alone, my father at sea. The woman stands in profile back against a wall, holding her charge, their faces side by side, the look on the child's face strangely prescient, a tiny furrow in the space between her brows. Neither of them looks toward the camera, nor do they look at each other. That year, when my mother took me for walks, she was mistaken again and again for my maid. Years later, she told me she'd say I was her daughter, and each time strangers would stare in disbelief, then empty the change from their pockets. Now I think of the betrayals of flesh, how she must have tried to make of her face an inscrutable mask and hold it there as they made their small offerings, pressing coins into my hands. How, like the woman in the photograph, she must have seemed, carrying me each day, white in her arms, as if she were a prop, a black backdrop, the dark foil in this American story. I'm going to finish up with just two poems now. This is one of the last poems I wrote for the book Thrall, my newest collection. My father took me to Monticello, Jefferson's home, for the first time about 25 years ago, and I knew in order to finish this book I had to take my father back there and to contend with some of the issues that had been prevalent in our relationship all those years. One of the things that changed when I took my father there from the time that he had taken me there is that now it has, of course, become the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 2 of Sally Hemings' children. My father and I debated this issue for many years. Obviously, I've won the argument. Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to finish up with the last poem from Native Guard, and the last thing I'd say is that growing up in the Deep South, monuments abound to the lost cause, to glorifying that old order of the Confederacy. And if you didn't know the history, as I know you all do, you might think that the South won the war because of all those monuments. Which can create a sense of psychological exile because it is a way of inscribing on the landscape one story and subjugating another. This poem has an epigraph from E.O. Wilson that reads, Homo sapiens is the only species to suffer psychological exile. South. I return to a stand of pines, bone-thin phalanx flanking the roadside, tangle of understory, a dialectic of dark and light, and magnolias blossoming like afterthought, each flower a surrender, white flags draped among the branches. I return to Land's End, the swath of coast clear-cut and buried in sand, mangrove, live oak, gulf weed raised and replaced by thin palms, palmettos, symbols of victory or defiance, over and over, marking this vanquished land. I return to a field of cotton, hallowed ground as slave legend goes, each bowl holding the ghosts of generations, those who measured their days by the heft of sacks and links of rows, whose sweat flecked the cotton plants still sewn into our clothes. I return to a country battlefield where colored troops fought and died, Port Hudson where their bodies swelled and blackened beneath the sun, unburied until Earth's green sheet pulled over them, unmarked by any headstones. Where the roads, buildings, and monuments are named to honor the Confederacy, where that old flag still hangs, I return to Mississippi, state that made a crime of me. Mulatto, half-breed, native in my native land, this place, they'll bury me. Thank you. Thank you very much.